Welcome to the war narrative where wars become stories. It is the winter of 1885, and the center of Sudan shakes under the sounds of war. For nearly a year, Khartoum, the treasure of the Nile, the base of British power, has stood strong against huge challenges. Governor-General Charles Gordon, the empire's tough guard, leads a group of about 7,000 men. They are tired, hungry, and trapped. The enemy army, 50,000 strong, moves closer like a tightening rope. Day after day, the Nile has carried whispers of danger. But now the whispers turn to screams. The walls of Khartoum have finally been broken through. The defenders, once so proud, fall apart before a wave of men using swords, spears, and rifles taken from earlier wins. Streets that once were filled with merchants and camel groups now echo with gunfire and cries of the dying. Regular people are killed alongside soldiers. The city becomes a maze of blood and fire. Yet, in the middle of the chaos, one man refuses to run away. On the steps of his palace, dressed in full ceremony uniform as though attending a final parade, Charles Gordon waits. He has sent away his staff, sent away even those loyal enough to share his end. Only one bodyguard remains, a final silent witness to his master's stubborn dignity. Gordon does not hide in shadows. He does not strengthen the doors. He stands openly, almost inviting the enemy warriors to take him. He knows this is his last stand. To the British public, Gordon was once a hero, a man of iron will, hard-proven in China during the Taiping Rebellion, where he earned the name Chinese Gordon. But that was decades ago. Now his hair is gray, his body worn, and his eyes carry the weight of disappointment. The empire that once celebrated him has left him abandoned. Promises of rescue missions have come too late. The Nile gunboats, the red-coated reinforcements, the lifeline from Cairo, all delayed by hesitation in London. And so Gordon, once the empire's proud crusader, is reduced to its martyr. He knows too that his death is not unique. The British Empire demands sacrifice, often without thanks. Its servants, scattered across the globe, are expected to give their time, their careers, even their lives for trade disguised as civilization. Gordon has seen it firsthand. The bitterness of locals forced out, the anger of rulers overthrown, the arrogance of imperial commands given from across the sea. Now, as the enemy soldiers rush closer, he understands that his death will be remembered not only as a tragedy, but as a sign of something deeper, the dangerous arrogance of empire. When the enemy finally arrives, Gordon does not raise his pistol. Stories differ on the exact moment. Some say he fought back, others that he stood still, but in every version he dies as he lived, unyielding, proud, and alone. For the enemy, it is a victory, a symbol that even the empire's most famous generals can fall. For Britain, it is a shame that will echo through parliament, newspapers, and households for years to come. Khartoum falls, but its story does not end here. In Gordon's death lies the perfect beginning to the greater story. The tale of how Britain came to Africa, how it fought to control it, and how despite its wins, the empire planted the seeds of its own ending. Long before Khartoum's walls broke under enemy swords, Britain's story in Africa began not with cannon fire, but with counting houses. In 1618, under the rule of King James I, a charter was given to the London-based Guinea Company. This purpose was simple: to control trade along the West African coast. There were no big armies or imperial announcements then, only record books, merchants, and the promise of profit. Gold and timber flowed first. Soon, however, human lives themselves became the most profitable cargo. The transatlantic slave trade, already growing under Portuguese and Spanish hands, pulled England into its bloody path. Ships left from English ports, carrying manufactured goods to Africa, trading them for captives, then sailing across the Atlantic to sell those people in the plantations of the Caribbean and Americas. The return trip carried sugar, rum, and tobacco, an unholy triangle where misery was the cement holding the empire's foundations together. Yet these ventures were weak. They were not colonies in the true sense, but dangerous outposts clinging to the humid, fever-filled coastlines. Europeans called it the white man's grave. Sailors who stepped ashore often carried their coffins with them, knowing malaria, yellow fever, or dysentery could strike within weeks. The death rates were shocking. Some posts saw nearly half of their European staff die within a single year. Expansion inland was unthinkable. The jungle itself seemed an enemy. And so for more than a century, Britain's empire in Africa remained little more than a string of trade forts like beads along a shoreline. The great interior kingdoms, the Asante, Dahomey, Oyo, remained mysterious powers seen only through translators, caravans, and second-hand tales. London's money people calculated profits without caring to learn the languages, customs, or political systems of the people they traded with. Africa to them was a record book entry, not a land. Still, these early ventures set a pattern that Britain's relationship with Africa was to be transactional, extracted, and deeply tangled with violence. Yet, it would take centuries and the collapse of Britain's first empire in America for Africa to become a stage of conquest rather than trade. For now, the empire's African story remained small, its ambition held back by disease and distance. But the seeds had been planted, and seeds once planted can wait for generations before they grow into destiny. The year was 1783, and Britain had just suffered a shame that shook its empire to the core, the loss of the American colonies. For generations, the New World had been the great experiment, a place where settlers could plant farms, build towns, and imagine futures tied to Britain's crown. But with independence declared and the 13 colonies gone, London's eyes turned elsewhere. If the empire could no longer expand across the Atlantic, perhaps Africa would serve as the next frontier. Yet Africa was not America. Disease still followed every coastline. European settlers who dreamed of carving out farms and plantations soon discovered that fever and parasites killed faster than any musket ball. The idea of vast British settler colonies seemed almost absurd, and so Britain tried something different. In 1787, a new colony was founded in Sierra Leone, not for merchants or planters, but for the unwanted and displaced. Its first residents were freed slaves, men and women who had fought for Britain during the American Revolution. Promised protection and new lives, many had found themselves abandoned in Nova Scotia or London, living in poverty and facing discrimination. Sierra Leone was their second chance. About 1,000 made the journey, a fragile community planted in hostile soil. The symbolism was powerful, a colony of the once enslaved living where the slave trade still thrived. But the reality was cruel. Within months, disease tore through the settlement. Graves multiplied faster than homes. Those who survived faced raids from neighboring groups angry about British intrusion. For London, Sierra Leone was both experiment and symbol. The experiment showed that colonization would not come easily. The symbol told the world that Britain, after profiting from slavery, now positioned itself as the liberator. It was a moral mask worn over an empire still deeply dependent on the trade in human lives. The contradiction was plain to see. Britain claimed to be championing freedom while its ships still carried chains across the Atlantic. To the freed men in Sierra Leone, the contradiction mattered less than survival. They built churches, schools, and a fragile sense of belonging. Even as their numbers shrank, their voices carried hymns into the African night, prayers of gratitude and defiance in equal measure. Though tiny and dangerous, Sierra Leone was a sign of things to come. It revealed both the hardships Britain would face in colonizing Africa and the continuing determination to plant its flag. Even in soil soaked with malaria and grief, Africa was no longer just a marketplace. It was becoming an imperial project born in the shadow of America's loss and carried on the shoulders of those who had once been enslaved. The empire had found a new stage, though it did not yet know the scale of the drama waiting for it. While Britain's first steps in West Africa were careful, in the south the story unfolded differently. There on the edge of the continent stood Cape Town, a settlement planted by the Dutch in 1652 as a resting station for ships sailing to Asia. For nearly a century and a half, Dutch farmers, the Boers, had spread inland, raising cattle and wheat in the rugged interior. But as the Napoleonic Wars broke out in Europe, the Cape's quiet importance became suddenly obvious. In 1795, when revolutionary France took over the Netherlands, Britain moved quickly. The danger was clear. If France controlled the Cape, the lifeline to India, the jewel of the crown, would be threatened. Two groups of British warships appeared in Table Bay, and soon the Union Jack flew over Cape Town. Though initially a wartime measure, the occupation hardened into permanence. By 1814, the Cape Colony was formally made part of the empire. At first, Britain promised not to interfere in the lives of the settlers, but promises in empire rarely lasted long. Judges began issuing new laws, always written in English, ignoring Dutch tongue and custom. To the Boers, this was not just government meddling, but a deliberate attack on their identity. They had left Europe generations earlier, seeking freedom from persecution and authority. Now a new authority, foreign, condescending, and distant, claimed mastery over their land. Cultural irritation soon deepened into anger. The British brought with them not only laws, but new ideas about society, race, and slavery. Under Dutch rule, slavery had been accepted, woven into farm life. The British, by contrast, were moving, however slowly, toward abolition. To the Boers, abolition threatened their economy and way of life. To the British, tolerating slavery was becoming politically impossible. The collision was inevitable. The Cape thus became a testing ground, a place where European powers fought not only for land, but for identity, values, and visions of the future. On its windswept plains, the seeds of future conflict were planted. For Britain, it was a strategic prize, a gateway to India and a foothold for expansion northward. For the Boers, it was home, and home, once threatened, is defended with a ferocity that no empire can easily crush. As the 19th century advanced, this tension would drive thousands of Boers away from British rule deeper into Africa's interior. But before that exodus, Britain's decision to end slavery would set fire to the fragile trust between ruler and ruled. In 1833, the British Parliament declared slavery illegal across the empire. To London, it was a triumph of morality, a long-fought campaign of conscience that had finally won. To the Boers of South Africa, it was nothing less than betrayal. Their livelihoods had been built upon enslaved labor woven into every farm, every harvest, every household. When abolition came, it was not only the economic loss that cut deep, but the way it was imposed, by distant lawmakers who neither asked nor listened. Payment was offered, but it was small and bureaucratic. Boer farmers felt cheated, treated as subjects of an empire that neither respected their culture nor cared for their future. For a people already angry about British interference, the abolition of slavery was the final spark. In their eyes, Britain had crossed a line from ruler to oppressor. And so began the Great Trek. Thousands of Dutch-speaking settlers packed wagons, gathered livestock, and turned their backs on Cape Town. Families pushed into the wilderness, traveling in long, ox-drawn caravans across unforgiving plains and rivers. It was less an exodus than a statement. If they could not live free under British rule, they would carve their independence from the heart of Africa itself. The journey was dangerous. Trekker diaries tell of swarms of locusts blocking out the sun, of wagons collapsing in rivers, of children buried in shallow graves by the roadside. Yet the Boers pressed on, hardened by faith and stubbornness. They saw themselves as modern Israelites, leaving behind a land of bondage in search of a promised land. Preachers compared them to biblical patriarchs chosen to build a new destiny. As they moved, they met African kingdoms, some hostile, others curious, some negotiating peace, others responding with violence. These encounters shaped the shifting map of southern Africa, forging alliances and sparking wars. New Boer republics, tiny, fragile, but defiant, sprang up in distant valleys and plateaus. They called them the Orange Free State, the Transvaal, names that would one day echo in headlines across the world. For the British, the trek was both a problem and a warning. It broke their hold on South Africa, but also ensured that the seeds of future conflict had been scattered far and wide. Where the British flag pulled back, anger followed. Where the Boers settled, they built not only farms but nations that would one day challenge the empire itself. The Great Trek was no simple migration. It was a declaration, a vow that no empire, however powerful, could erase a people's sense of destiny. While settlers and Boers wrestled over the fate of South Africa, Britain's attention was also fixed on the lush forests of the West. There, in what is now Ghana, rose the Asante Empire, a powerful state built on trade, gold, and disciplined armies. For years, tensions simmered between the Asante and Britain, each suspicious of the other's intentions. In 1824, the spark came at last. An African officer serving in a British unit was murdered by Asante warriors. To the colonial governor of Sierra Leone, Sir Charles McCarthy, this was intolerable. Convinced that a swift demonstration of British strength would end the matter, he marched with roughly 3,000 men into Asante territory. He believed himself the hammer and the Asante merely brittle glass. What he found instead was iron. At the banks of the Pra River, McCarthy's force met 10,000 Asante warriors. The British and their allies were overwhelmed, their ranks shattered by the ferocity of the attack. McCarthy himself was struck down. The battle ended not in victory but in massacre. Barely a fraction of his force escaped. What happened next ensured that his name would be remembered not for triumph but for shame. The Asante king celebrating his victory had McCarthy's skull taken, polished and trimmed in gold. For years it was used as a drinking cup in the royal court, an object both gruesome and symbolic, a trophy of defiance against empire. To the British this was an outrage, a scar on their pride. To the Asante it was a statement. They would not be bullied into submission by foreign powers who neither respected their sovereignty nor feared their strength. For the moment, the empire had been stopped. Yet Britain did not forget. 30 years later, when they returned to the Gold Coast in greater force, the memory of McCarthy's skull still stung. It would drive them toward revenge, treaties, and eventually the capture of Kumasi itself. But in 1824, the lesson was bitterly clear. Africa was no passive prize. Its kingdoms had teeth and they would bite. The golden skull of McCarthy became more than a relic. It was a warning that even empire could bleed. For decades after Charles McCarthy's skull was gilded and raised in Asante triumph, an uneasy truce held. In 1831, a treaty drew the Pra River as the border between British and Asante areas of influence. Trade resumed, but the tension never vanished. Both sides watched the other carefully, waiting for the next spark. That spark came when Britain, seeking to expand its coastal footholds, acquired the Dutch Gold Coast colony. To the Asante, this was more than opportunism. It was intrusion, strangling their trade and threatening their authority. Skirmishes escalated into war once again. This time Britain arrived with a more professional army numbering about 2,500 men armed with modern rifles, artillery, and Congreve rockets that streaked like fire across the skies. The campaign was short and devastating. The Asante fought with determination, but they were outmatched by the empire's firepower and relentless advance. In 1874, British troops pushed into Kumasi, the Asante capital. What they found amazed them. A sprawling palace filled with books, artworks, ivory, and treasures. Proof of a kingdom far more sophisticated than the caricatures of savages so often painted in London papers. But admiration quickly gave way to destruction. The British, in a pattern repeated across the continent, did not preserve what they found. They destroyed it. The palace was stripped, looted, and then blown apart with explosives. Artifacts of Asante heritage vanished into private collections and museum halls half a world away. The city itself was left in ruins, its grandeur reduced to rubble. For Britain, it was a victory, proof that the empire's might could humble even Africa's proudest kingdoms. For the Asante, it was disaster, a humiliation that burned as bitterly as McCarthy's defeat had once burned Britain. Yet the story was not over. The Asante would rise again, resisting British advance in future wars until their final defeat at the dawn of the 20th century. In Kumasi's destruction lay the essence of empire, a contradiction of awe and destruction. The British marveled at what they found, then destroyed it, as if empire could only prove its dominance by erasing the achievements of others. In 1867, a boy on the banks of the Orange River picked up a curious stone. It glittered strangely in the light, and when brought to traders it was confirmed. A diamond. Soon, More were found near the dusty settlement of Kimberley, and with them came a fever that would transform southern Africa. Within a decade, Kimberley had swollen from a sleepy outpost into a bustling boom town. Prospectors from across the empire poured in: Britons, Boers, Africans, fortune seekers of every sort. Tents gave way to shacks and shacks to wooden buildings, while the ground itself was torn open by thousands of hands clawing for fortune. From the earth emerged not only diamonds, but conflict. For Britain, the discovery was a thunderclap. Diamonds meant wealth, and wealth meant power. The Cape Colony was no longer just a strategic outpost guarding the route to India. It was now a treasure chest waiting to be opened. But the riches lay beyond Cape Town's reach, deep in territories controlled by Boer republics and African kingdoms. To secure them, Britain would need more than miners. It would need political control. In 1874, Henry Herbert, Secretary of State for the Colonies, proposed a grand design: unify the Boer settlements and British holdings into a single federation. This federation, he argued, would streamline governance, prevent endless quarrels, and most importantly, give Britain effective control over the diamond fields. On paper, it looked like order. In reality, it was provocation. The Boers, fiercely independent, pulled back. They had trekked into the wilderness to escape empire, not to be folded back into its embrace. To them, Herbert's federation was a cage. Even the promise of prosperity could not soften their distrust of London. They saw British interference not as partnership, but as theft. Meanwhile, African communities near Kimberley bore the heaviest burdens. Thousands were pressed into labor under harsh contracts, their lands taken by mining companies that treated them as obstacles to be removed. Wealth flowed from the soil, but it flowed outward, into British banks, shipping lanes, and imperial coffers, while those who had tilled the land for generations were pushed aside. Diamonds, more than gold or land, accelerated the collision of empire and independence in South Africa. They drew Britain deeper into the interior, setting the stage for struggles not only with the Boers, but with one of Africa's most powerful peoples, the Zulu. Long before Britain's eyes fell upon them, the Zulu had already forged a reputation as one of the most disciplined and fearsome powers in Africa. Under King Shaka in the early 19th century, they transformed from a small clan into a kingdom that dominated southern Africa. Shaka's reforms, tight regimental organization, rigorous drills, and the deadly short-stabbing spear known as the Iklwa turned Zulu warriors into a force that could shatter enemies through speed, precision, and overwhelming numbers. By the 1870s, Shaka was long gone, but his legacy lived on in the disciplined armies of King Cetshwayo. Numbering in the tens of thousands, the Zulu military was still drilled to perfection. Their tactics, outflanking horns, encircling an enemy while the chest struck head-on, remained devastatingly effective. To the British officials at the Cape, however, this strength was seen less as genius and more as a threat that had to be removed. In 1877, Britain annexed the Boer Republic of the Transvaal, bringing them directly into Zulu territory. Colonial officials, ambitious and eager for conquest, crafted a plan. They would provoke the Zulu into conflict, then use Zulu aggression as the excuse for annexation. Sir Henry Bartle Frere, High Commissioner of Southern Africa, sent an ultimatum to Cetshwayo: disband your army and accept British authority. It was not a negotiation. It was an insult. Cetshwayo's reply was simple: no. He would not dismantle the backbone of his kingdom at the whim of a foreign power. And so, in January 1879, British columns marched into Zululand. They came with 1,800 soldiers, confident that rifles, artillery, and imperial discipline would quickly cow their enemy. Instead, they found themselves outmaneuvered. On January 22nd, at the Battle of Isandlwana, the Zulu struck with devastating precision. Hidden by the rolling hills, tens of thousands of warriors swept around the British camp, their horns of the buffalo encircling the enemy. The redcoats fired volley after volley, their Martini Henry rifles cutting swaths through the advancing masses. But the Zulu tide did not stop. Ammunition began to run low. The British had neglected to fortify their position, certain that no native force could match them. Their confidence dissolved into chaos. By the day's end, the Zulu had overrun the camp. More than 1,300 British and colonial troops lay dead, the greatest defeat the empire had yet suffered in Africa. To London it was a shockwave. To the Zulu, it was vindication. Proof that their kingdom was no relic, but a living power capable of humbling even the mightiest empire on earth. But even in their hour of triumph, Cetshwayo knew the empire would not forgive humiliation. The Zulu had won a battle, but they had awakened a storm. The very night that Isandlwana's slaughter sent shockwaves across the empire, another story was already being written, one that would soothe British pride and feed the myth of imperial heroism. It unfolded at a small mission station called Rorke's Drift, a lonely outpost of mud walls and thatched roofs sitting astride the Buffalo River. Inside were barely 150 men, most of them engineers and hospital orderlies, commanded by 2 junior lieutenants, John Chard and Gonville Bromhead. Many were exhausted, still reeling from news of Isandlwana. Then scouts brought word. A Zulu force of more than 4,000 warriors was approaching. For most, the logic was clear: abandon the post and flee. But Chard and Bromhead chose otherwise. They fortified the station as best they could, stacking mealie bags into barricades, hammering planks into firing positions, and preparing for the storm. The patients in the hospital were too wounded to move. The garrison resolved to fight not only for themselves, but for those who could not run. The attack came in waves. Zulu warriors surged forward with spears flashing and muskets cracking. The defenders fired in steady volleys, each Martini Henry rifle barking flame. Barricades shook under the force of impact. Shields slammed against makeshift walls, and desperate hand-to-hand combat broke out around the hospital. Flames soon engulfed the thatched roof as soldiers dragged the wounded through holes hacked in the walls. One by one, under fire. The battle raged for 12 brutal hours. Ammunition dwindled. Exhaustion set in. Yet the defenders held. When dawn broke, the Zulu withdrew, leaving hundreds of bodies scattered around the station. Astonishingly, only 17 of the garrison had been killed. News of Rorke's Drift raced across Britain. At a time when newspapers had just reported a humiliating defeat at Isandlwana, here was a tale of courage, defiance, and victory against impossible odds. The empire seized upon it. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded, the most ever for a single action in British history. Paintings, songs, and later films would immortalize Rorke's Drift as a story of pluck and perseverance, a symbol of British resilience even on the darkest day. Yet beneath the legend lay a harder truth. The battle had been one of survival, not conquest. The Zulu had fought with equal bravery, suffering losses far beyond those of the defenders. But their story, their heroism, would find no place in British memory. Empire remembers what flatters it. The dead at Isandlwana were forgotten, but the heroes of Rorke's Drift were celebrated as proof that the empire, though bloodied, would not bow. And indeed, Britain had no intention of bowing. If the Zulu had shown their strength, Britain would now show its vengeance. In the aftermath of Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift, Britain faced a choice: withdraw from Zululand or return with overwhelming force. For an empire whose pride had been pierced so deeply, retreat was unthinkable. London demanded redemption. A second invasion was planned, this time with no illusions, no careless underestimation. Months later, when the British columns crossed into Zululand once more, they came like a machine. Engineers built fortified camps at every halt. Soldiers advanced in tight formations. Cavalry screened the flanks and artillery was positioned with deadly precision. Gone was the arrogance of the first campaign. In its place stood methodical calculation. The Zulu prepared to resist again. King Cetshwayo still commanded tens of thousands of warriors, but he knew the odds had shifted. The British now had Gatling guns and mountain artillery, tools of war the Zulu could not match. The warriors who had triumphed at Isandlwana would now face walls of steel and fire. On July 4, 1879, the two forces met at Ulundi, the Zulu capital. The British formed a hollow square, bayonets bristling outward, artillery at the corners, cavalry poised to strike. The Zulu impi charged in waves, their war cries echoing across the veldt. Spears struck shields, bullets tore through flesh, and the field filled with smoke and screams. Time and again, the Zulu surged forward, only to be cut down by relentless volleys and the rattle of Gatling fire. At last, British cavalry swept out from the square, slashing into the retreating ranks. The Zulu broke. Lundy fell. Its great royal homesteads burned to ash. Cetshwayo was captured and later exiled. His kingdom shattered. The war that had begun with humiliation ended in ruthless triumph. Britain annexed Zululand, adding another jewel, blood-stained though it was, to the imperial crown. In London, the victory was hailed as vindication, proof that the empire could not be humbled for long. Yet the cost was immense. Thousands of Zulu dead lay as testimony to the empire's iron will, and a proud kingdom was reduced to a colonial subject. But conquest did not bring peace. Even as Britain celebrated its victory over the Zulu, another storm was brewing in South Africa. The Boers, resentful of British interference and emboldened by their independence, were preparing to rise in rebellion. The empire had crushed one enemy. Another waited just over the horizon. No sooner had the Union Jack risen over Zululand than unrest stirred in another quarter. The Boers, the Dutch-speaking farmers who had trekked deep into the interior decades earlier, watched Britain's expanding shadow with growing alarm. Their republic in the Transvaal had already been annexed in 1877, justified by British officials as a measure of protection. In truth, it was conquest disguised as kindness. The Boers were not a people easily defeated. They were stubborn, fiercely independent, and accustomed to hardship. Life on the frontier had shaped them into skilled riders and marksmen. To them, Britain's annexation was tyranny, another attempt to bind free men under foreign chains. By 1880, their patience had snapped. The First Boer War had begun. It was unlike Britain's other colonial conflicts. There were no great set-piece battles, no storming of capitals or hollow squares of redcoats facing spear-wielding warriors. Instead, the Boers fought from the shadows. Mounted on hardy ponies, they struck in sudden raids, ambushing convoys and melting into the veldt before reinforcements could arrive. They knew the land intimately. Every ridge, every water hole, every patch of scrub. British columns blundered after ghosts, growing weary and demoralized. The fighting culminated in February 1881 at the Battle of Majuba Hill. British troops, believing they held the high ground, entrenched themselves on the summit. The Boers, undeterred, scaled the slopes with uncanny skill, using cover and sharpshooting to deadly effect. By the day's end, the British position collapsed. Over 90 men were killed, including Major General George Colley, the commander himself. For the Empire, it was another humiliation. This time, however, London hesitated. Memories of Isandlwana were still fresh, and the public had little appetite for yet another costly war on a distant frontier. Instead of escalating, Britain chose compromise. The Transvaal was granted self-government once more, its independence restored under British suzerainty. For the Boers, it was a triumph, a vindication of their stubborn defiance. For Britain, it was a bitter pill, a concession forced by circumstance. But beneath the uneasy peace lay a truth both sides knew. This was not the end. Diamonds had already made the region too valuable. Gold soon to be discovered would make it priceless. The empire would return, and next time it would not leave so easily. While South Africa seethed with rebellion, Britain's eyes were also fixed on the north, on Egypt, a land whose value had soared with the cutting of a single channel of water. In 1869, after years of labor and staggering expense, the Suez Canal opened. For the first time in history, European ships could bypass the long and dangerous journey around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, sailing directly from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and onto Asia. For Britain, whose empire rested on India, the canal was nothing less than a lifeline. Whoever controlled Suez controlled the artery of empire. Yet Egypt itself was crumbling. Years of extravagance and mismanagement by the Khedives, the hereditary rulers, had driven the state deep into debt. Lavish palaces, failed projects, even a botched invasion of Ethiopia, had left the treasury empty. By the late 1870s, European creditors, particularly British and French, all but owned Egypt's finances. Resentment grew among Egyptians who saw their nation reduced to a pawn in foreign hands. In 1879, this resentment exploded into revolt. Ahmed Urabi, a charismatic army officer, rose at the head of a nationalist movement demanding an end to foreign domination. Crowds filled the streets of Cairo, chanting his name, and for the first time in centuries, Egypt's future seemed to belong to Egyptians themselves. But in London, Urabi was not hailed as a reformer. He was painted as a threat to commerce, to stability, and above all to the canal. Britain intervened. In July 1882, British warships anchored off the coast of Alexandria. As tensions rose, the solution chosen was as brutal as it was familiar: bombardment. Cannon thundered, shells tore into the ancient port, and flames consumed entire districts. The city burned while its residents fled in panic. To restore order, the empire first reduced one of the Mediterranean's greatest cities to smoldering ruin. Soon after, British troops marched inland. At Tel el-Kabir, they met Urabi's forces. Though brave, the nationalists were no match for British discipline and firepower. The battle was swift, the defeat decisive. Urabi was captured and exiled, and the deposed Khedive Muhammad Tofek Pasha was restored to his throne, though in truth he now ruled only at Britain's pleasure. From that moment on, Egypt was effectively under British control. Soldiers garrisoned Cairo. Administrators oversaw finances, and the Suez Canal became an imperial highway. Though Egypt remained an Ottoman province in name, in reality, it was Britain's protectorate in all but title. Not until 1922 would Egyptians regain a measure of independence. For Britain, the conquest of Egypt was a triumph of strategy, securing the gateway to India. For Egypt, it was another chapter in a long story of foreign domination, written in fire and smoke over Alexandria's skies. By the early 1880s, Africa was no longer just a backdrop for scattered wars and trading posts. It was becoming the object of an unprecedented frenzy, a scramble for territory, resources, and prestige. The Industrial Revolution had changed everything. Factories in Europe demanded raw materials in staggering quantities: palm oil for soap, rubber for machines, copper for wires, gold and diamonds for wealth. Population pressures swelled Europe's cities, leaving the poor restless and governments eager for outlets. Politicians and businessmen alike began to look at Africa not as a mystery, but as an opportunity. Yet, this sudden hunger carried risks. France, Germany, Portugal, and Britain all pressed their claims, each fearful that rivals might seize too much. The old balance of coastal trading posts was no longer enough. The continent's interior, vast, barely mapped, and filled with kingdoms and societies Europeans scarcely understood, was the prize. Tensions mounted. War between European powers loomed. It was then that Germany's Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, convened a meeting in Berlin in 1884. Representatives from 13 European nations and the United States gathered in glittering halls beneath chandeliers to decide Africa's fate. Absent from the conference were the very people whose lives would be reshaped by its outcomes. No African ruler, chief, or emissary sat at the table. The Berlin Conference set the rules of partition. Coastal claims had to be backed by effective occupation of the interior. Boundaries were to be drawn, spheres of influence declared, and disputes settled through negotiation rather than open European war. It was in effect a carve-up of a continent, lines on maps slashed across lands whose peoples and histories the delegates barely bothered to consider. In the aftermath, Africa's future was sealed. The scramble began in earnest. Explorers mapped rivers and mountains. Merchants staked claims. And armies marched inland to plant flags over territories that had never heard of Europe, much less Berlin. Britain, though cautious at first, quickly embraced the scramble. The empire already controlled strategic points, the Cape and the Suez Canal. Now, with rivals pressing on every frontier, Britain sought to fill in the spaces between, north to south, sea to sea. It was a dream of continuity, a ribbon of red stretching across maps in classrooms and drawing rooms alike. The Berlin Conference may have seemed like order, but on the ground it meant chaos. Communities that had coexisted for centuries suddenly found themselves divided by invisible borders, claimed in the name of kings they had never seen. For Africans, It was the beginning of a storm from which there would be no shelter. For centuries, Africa's vast interior had been called the white man's grave. It was not armies or fortresses that kept Europeans at bay, but disease, malaria, yellow fever, dysentery. These invisible foes struck down sailors, traders, and soldiers alike. Even the strongest men rarely lasted long beyond the humid coasts. Expansion inland seemed impossible. But by the late 19th century, science and industry began to tip the balance. Steamships once confined to rivers in Europe now churned up the Congo, the Niger, and the Nile, pushing farther into the heart of the continent. Railways followed, cutting across savanna and jungle, stitching together imperial outposts. Iron tracks made distance irrelevant. Supplies and troops could now be moved where once only caravans dared tread. Even more decisive was medicine. Quinine extracted from the bark of the cinchona tree emerged as a weapon against malaria. Though bitter and imperfect, it kept fevers at bay long enough for expeditions to survive. What had once been a death sentence became with a daily dose survivable. Yellow fever still haunted the coast, but it no longer ended campaigns before they began. And then there were the weapons. The Maxim gun, first demonstrated in 1884, was a revolution in death. Capable of firing hundreds of rounds a minute, it gave European armies a terrible advantage over indigenous forces armed with muskets, spears, or swords. A single machine gun entrenched on a ridge could sweep away entire regiments. To London and Paris, it was not merely technology. It was reassurance. With steel, fire, and medicine, the interior was no longer forbidden. For Britain, this meant confidence bordering on arrogance. Officials remembering humiliations at Isandlwana or Majuba Hill convinced themselves that the era of being humbled by native armies was over. With quinine in the kit and Maxims on the field, they believed no African kingdom could withstand them. But the empire's new tools did not erase old mistakes. Overconfidence still lingered. The scornful assumption that Africans would fold before modern weapons often led to rash decisions, reckless advances, and wars far bloodier than London ever anticipated. The empire had unlocked the gates of Africa, but stepping through them would mean endless conflict, resistance, and atrocities disguised as progress. The age of limited coastal trade was over. Now empire marched inland, convinced that technology had made it invincible. By the late 19th century, the Kingdom of Benin stood as one of West Africa's most renowned powers. Centered in what is now southern Nigeria, Benin was famed for its artistry, its bronze castings, and its elaborate city of earthen walls and grand courtyards. Its Oba or king presided over a kingdom that had traded with Europeans for centuries, yet fiercely guarded its independence. The British, however, had grown impatient. Palm oil and rubber from the region were in high demand, and Benin's reluctance to open its markets fully to imperial traders was seen not as sovereignty, but as obstruction. In 1897, a British official named James Robert Phillips attempted a bold maneuver. With about 250 African soldiers disguised as porters and escort, he advanced toward Benin City under the pretense of diplomacy. His true aim was to force open the kingdom to British control. The plan ended in disaster. The force was intercepted and nearly all were killed in what Britain would later call the Benin Massacre. Only 2 officers escaped. In London, outrage flared. But behind the outrage was an opportunity. The deaths provided the excuse Britain had been waiting for. Within weeks, a punitive expedition of 1,200 men was assembled. This time they came openly with rifles, artillery, and Maxim guns. Villages along the way were burned. Resistance was fierce, but the outcome was foregone. After a 10-day siege, British troops stormed Benin City. What they found astonished even them: vast compounds, intricate architecture, and thousands of bronzes, ivories, and artworks that testified to centuries of cultural brilliance. And then, true to imperial habit, they destroyed it. The city was set ablaze. Temples and palaces were reduced to ash. The priceless bronzes, masterpieces of African civilization, were looted and shipped to Europe, where they still sit in museums and private collections today. To Britain, it was a victory wrapped in the language of justice. To Benin, it was devastation, the destruction of a kingdom's heart. A civilization that had thrived long before Europeans arrived was humiliated. Its treasures scattered across the globe. The fall of Benin revealed the empire's naked logic. Admiration for African culture did not lead to respect. It led to looting. Britain marveled at what it destroyed and destroyed what it could not control. If diamonds had already drawn Britain deeper into South Africa, gold would pull it into the bloodiest struggle of all. In the 1880s, prospectors in the Transvaal struck upon immense deposits of gold, the richest the world had yet seen. The discovery transformed the once isolated Boer republic into a prize every empire coveted. To London, leaving such wealth in the hands of the Boers was unthinkable. Enter Cecil Rhodes, empire builder, businessman, and dreamer of a British Africa stretching from Cape to Cairo. Rhodes embodied the ruthless ambition of the age. As founder of the British South Africa Company and a leading figure in Cape politics, he viewed the Boers not as neighbors but as obstacles. Where diplomacy faltered, he turned to provocation. His company funded incursions, manipulated markets, and stoked tensions, all designed to bring the Transvaal under imperial control. By 1899, the inevitable erupted, the Second Boer War. Unlike the brief skirmishes of the past, this was total war. The Boers, masters of guerrilla tactics, struck swiftly and vanished into the veldt. They knew the terrain, rode fast ponies, and carried Mauser rifles that matched the British in range and accuracy. British troops, though numerous, found themselves harried, ambushed, and humiliated in early encounters. London responded with ferocity. Reinforcements poured in until British forces swelled to nearly 500,000 men. The Empire unleashed a scorched earth campaign, burning Boer farms, destroying crops, and seizing livestock. Families were driven from their homes. Women and children alongside black Africans caught in the conflict were herded into concentration camps, the first of their kind in modern history. Conditions were horrific. Overcrowding, disease, and starvation claimed tens of thousands of lives. By war's end, nearly 26,000 Boer women and children, and some 20,000 Africans had died behind barbed wire. For 3 years, the struggle dragged on. The Boers fought with grim determination, refusing to surrender even as their homes were destroyed and their families imprisoned. But by 1902, exhausted and outnumbered, they gave up. The Boer republics were absorbed into the empire, united with the Cape Colony and Natal in what became the Union of South Africa. To Britain, the war was victory, proof that no colony could defy the empire's might. But it was a victory poisoned by its cost. International outrage at the camps tarnished Britain's reputation. At home, the public wrestled with unease at the brutal methods used in the name of empire. And beneath it all, the seeds of apartheid had been planted. By granting political privilege to white settlers while sidelining African voices, Britain ensured that the new Union of South Africa would be built on inequality. In Rhodes's vision of empire, there was no room for justice, only conquest. By the dawn of the 20th century, Britain's empire in Africa stretched wider than ever before. From Cape Town to Cairo, the red of the Union Jack seemed unbroken. Yet beneath the map's bold colors lay fractures, resentments, rebellions, and the costs of conquest. One of the bloodiest reminders came in Sudan. There, the Mahdiist revolt, which had claimed the life of Charles Gordon at Khartoum in 1885, still raged. Led by Muhammad Ahmad, the self-declared Mahdi, Sudanese fighters had united tribes and villages under a banner of resistance to foreign rule. For 9 years, British and Egyptian forces fought bitter desert campaigns against them. It was not until 1898 at the Battle of Omdurman that General Kitchener's modern army, backed by machine guns and artillery, crushed the Mahdiist forces in a storm of fire. Tens of thousands fell in a single day, ending Sudan's independence for a generation. Gordon's death had been avenged, but the victory left a bitter taste, proof of the empire's might and of its mercilessness. With conquest complete, Britain turned from expansion to consolidation. In 1904, the Entente Cordiale with France ended decades of rivalry, freeing both nations to focus on a rising challenger, Germany. Africa, once a prize fought over by European powers, became a staging ground for future conflicts yet to come. In South Africa, the union created in 1910 brought Boers and Britons together under one flag, but not Africans. White minority rule was entrenched, paving the way for the codified system of apartheid. In the 1940s, what had begun as an imperial compromise hardened into one of history's most infamous regimes. Across the continent, Britain invested in railways, telegraphs, and ports, projects that knitted together territories for trade and governance. Many of these structures still stand today. Yet, these legacies were double-edged. The railways carried soldiers as often as goods. The telegraph transmitted commands of subjugation as much as commerce. Every beam and track was laid at a cost. Lives disrupted and cultures destabilized. And then, after the Second World War, came the unraveling. The empire that once claimed the mantle of eternity began to retreat. In 1961, the Union of South Africa severed its final ties with Britain. One by one, colonies claimed independence, their flags rising in place of the Union Jack. What remained was a paradox. On one hand, colonial architecture, legal systems, and infrastructure endured. On the other, scars of violence, exploitation, and racial hierarchy lingered, shaping nations' paths long after independence. The empire had claimed it brought civilization, but it left behind division. Yet, Africa is not defined by empire's shadow alone. Today, many of its nations are among the fastest-growing economies in the world, building futures beyond colonial legacies. In some cases, their growth even surpasses that of their former occupiers. The empires came to Africa with guns, greed, and flags. But the continent endures, rising again from the ashes of its twilight. The story of Britain in Africa is not one of triumph, nor simply of tragedy. It is a story of ambition and arrogance, of resistance and resilience, of lives lost and futures remade. From Khartoum to Cape Town, from Benin to Cairo, the empire's path is written not only in red upon maps, but in blood, ash, and memory.